Chapter 2. Professor Kleist leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, his bright blue eyes focused intently on the wall monitors in front of his glass desk. 50-meter square screens filled the huge wall, all following one activity or another around the base. If the professor wanted, he could divide each screen by 4 or 8 or even 16, all showing different scenes. It was one of the most sophisticated security systems available in the corporation, and since the system's installment, he had upgraded it considerably. It was one of his most prized tools, and he spent many hours in front of it, just watching the 1,500 people under his command. With his system, no one on Charon base sneezed, whispered, or made love without him knowing about it. As with many things on Charon base, the professor had seen to every detail of the construction of his office. On Earth, the almost gymnasium-sized room would have been considered excessive. The oak walls and shelves a frivolity, the thick carpet almost too plush. In one corner was a full kitchen, always stocked with fresh food and drink. Shelves of real books, research, reference, and fiction filled 2 walls. Those books were his personal collection, and it had taken most of one transport ship's capacity just to get them here. But it had been a small expense in exchange for his needs and what he had accomplished for the corporation so far. But the central figure of his office was the huge oak desk and high-backed chair facing the wall of monitors. A wall that curved slightly, such that there was nothing else in view, like a surround vision movie, only those screens weren't showing a film. The surface of the desk was larger than most king-size beds, measuring 2 meters deep by 4 meters long. From that desk and the control board that occupied the left third of the top, he could access the thousands of miniature video relay systems and microphones hidden throughout the base. Larson, the chief of security, stood slightly behind the professor and to his left. From there, he could work the monitor control board on the desk when the professor asked him to. Unlike Kleist, who was built solidly, with broad shoulders and thick arms, Larson was tall, skinny, and deceptively strong. He had short black hair and deep black eyes. It seemed like he never blinked, which unnerved many around him. Like the professor, Larson now stared at the Center 4 monitors, all presently showing different scenes from Sergeant Green's recent mission into the alien sector. The monitors above the Center 4 were focused on the Marines' current activities. Kleist pointed at the bloody picture of Boone, deserted in the alien section. With a few keystrokes on the inside right of the control board, he focused the camera in close and sat forward in his chair. Boone lay sprawled on the stone floor, the head and upper chest of the alien warrior slightly across her legs. Her hair hung out of the hole in the back of her helmet, and one alien arm and claw still clung to her waist. There were no other bugs in sight, and nothing had disturbed the scene since the retreat of the Marines. Can we save the body? Larson stared at the scene for a moment before answering. I'll have some of my men check, but I doubt it. The idiot who killed the alien managed to cover the woman's body in acid blood. I doubt the armor could hold it all back. Kleist nodded. I hope you're not right, but I suspect you might be. Check anyway. If the burns are only superficial, we could use it. Larson turned away from the professor and softly gave instructions into his personal mic. The professor nodded in satisfaction, leaving one screen on the woman's body so he could watch when Larson's men got there. His hand did a quick dance on the control board, then he leaned back in his chair and ran both hands through his thinning hair, his gaze again intent on the four Marines as they half carried, half dragged the alien warrior towards the labs. He watched, following their progress through the corridors as the system automatically switched from hidden camera to camera until the four Marines had the warrior delivered to the dissection vat. Then he leaned forward and punched another key, sending his voice into the lab. "Nice work, Sergeant Green. It looks like a fine specimen." He paused for a moment until all four Marines were looking up at the one obvious camera in the corner of the lab above them. Then he said, "But I am distressed that you slaughtered the other one, however." "He's distressed?" Private Choi shouted. The professor could see the private shaking and smiled. Good. He had gotten to the kid. The private pulled off his helmet, his red hair falling long over the back of his suit. "Kleist, you son of a bitch! I should—" Green grabbed the private's arm and yanked him almost off his feet. Green was twice the size of Choi, and just one arm was as big around as Choi's waist. Kleist sat back in his chair, watching, smiling. Sergeant Green was not one to be underestimated. Not only was he a big brute of a man, he understood very well the ruling systems here on Charon base. "Sir, I can explain." Sergeant Green started, but Choi yanked his arm away and stepped closer to the one obvious camera. "Kleist," Choi said, "we could all have been killed in that ant farm of yours. Boone is dead. You understand? Dead!" He yelled the words, though the meaning of them started to choke him up. But he went on. "And all you can be distressed about is that we killed one of your bugs. I don't think you're playing with a full deck." Kleist smiled and turned to Larson, who was also grinning. "Sir," Sergeant Green started to say, stepping up beside Choi and shoving him roughly aside. "Sergeant Green," Kleist said softly, but with enough force to make the sergeant stop. "I can appreciate the private's feelings, but I suggest he restrain himself before he says something he will regret. It was a successful mission. That will be all for the day." Kleist punched the microphone off, then leaned back to observe what happened next. He could hear everything they were saying, even when they whispered. This was going to be interesting. "Kiss his big ass, why don't you?" Choi said, turning square on the sergeant. His face was almost as red as his hair, and he was half crouched in an attack posture. "Private!" Sergeant Green said sharply. "Do yourself a favor and rein it in." Choi seemed to deflate slightly, his shoulders slumped and his gaze dropped to the floor. The sergeant took a deep breath and let it out. "Look, I'm sorry about Boone, but there's a time and a place for everything. Here and now is not it. Understand?" "Yeah, right," Choi said. He threw his helmet across the room and it smashed into a wall, scattering files and making a lab table jump under the force of the impact. Green put a firm hand on his shoulder and said softly, "The bugs aren't the only thing you have to worry about around here. Now clam it up and hit the showers." He waited until Choi had shrugged off his hand and started towards the door. Then he turned to the other two members of the squad. And that goes for the both of you, too. Professor Kleist laughed and leaned back in his chair. How right you are, Sergeant. How right you are. He spun to face Larson. It seems the stock needs some new breeding material, and Private Choi there just volunteered. It seems that he did, Larson said, smiling. The professor stood and slipped into his white lab coat. I have work to do. This new warrior just may be the one. I'm close. So very close. Captain Joyce Palmer pulled the yellow Harley-Davidson cap down firmly on her head, and then strapped herself into the pilot's chair, buckling first the lap belt and then both shoulder straps. Deegan was already strapped in beside her, running diagnostic checks and preparing for docking. In front of them was the main control board for the shuttle, and 2 windows looking out into the blackness of space. In the center between the windows was a large monitor, at the moment black and not in use. Their passenger, Mr. Cray, looked tired and somewhat ruffled. He was strapped into one of the 2 passenger seats along the wall behind Deegan. He wore pressed cloth pants, a dress shirt unbuttoned at the neck, and a brown leather jacket. She had nodded hello as she passed him in the small cockpit area of the shuttle, and he nodded back without a smile. In the entire trip, he hadn't said more than 2 sentences to her. Deegan had talked his ear off over the one dinner before cold sleep, but she doubted if Cray had even said 3 words back. Of course, Deegan didn't usually need more than 3 words to keep him going for hours. Nice shirt, she said to Deegan as she finished her adjustments and slipped the headset over her cap. It was a ritual they always went through right before landing. Deegan always wore his lucky Budweiser t-shirt with a faded picture of an ugly dog on it. He said it had been his dad's. It had been patched more times than she wanted to think about, and it still had holes all over it. But it was his lucky t-shirt, and he always wore it for landings. I'm glad you like it, he said, smiling. Behind them, she heard Cray give a snort of disgust. That was good. At least he had some taste. Her lucky landing clothes were far less obvious. She just had on a white t-shirt, brown cloth slacks, and a brown open vest. In the pocket of the vest, she had a picture of Cass and Drake. That picture always rode against her chest and her heart every takeoff or landing. It wasn't as obvious a good luck charm as Deegan's shirt, but it was her private one. She adjusted the mic so it was just below her lower lip, then nodded to Deegan, and punched up the transmit code. Charon Base Flight Control. This is the transport vessel Caliban, requesting landing clearance. Sending identification codes now. She punched in 2 more sequences on the console in front of her, then said, Over. Deegan pointed through the viewport at the bright light growing quickly in front of them. There she is. Hell in space. Our soon-to-be home away from home. Roger, Caliban? The deep voice of Hank, the flight controller, filled the cabin. Hangar 12 is clear and ready to receive you. Hope you had a safe trip, Joyce. Over. Deegan glanced at Joyce and smiled, the glint in his eyes letting her know that he knew what had happened between Hank and her on the last run here. Or at least he thought he knew. Knowing the lack of privacy on Charon base, he probably did. Every damn detail. She ignored her co-pilot. "So far, so good," she said. "Over." "We're in the tube," Deegan said. "Normal to profile. Cutting thrusters." He was still smiling at her. "All right," she said. "Let's tuck her in. And Deegan?" "Yes, boss." "Watch those corners this time." Deegan laughed. "I missed that door by a good 10 meters last time. This is a walk in the park." She snorted. "When did you last see someone take 80,000 tons of ugly metal for a stroll?" He laughed again, but didn't take his eyes off the instruments. She sat back and watched as Deegan, one of the best solo pilots working, took them in. Within 30 minutes, he had the transport sitting snugly in the middle of the docking bay. "Hangar deck secure, outer doors closed, deck pressurized," Hank's voice announced at a moment after Deegan cut thrusters. "Crew and passengers, please report to decontamination." "Will do," Joyce said, and cut the link. She had to admit that she was looking forward to seeing Hank again. It seemed like it had been a long time, even though for her it had been only a little over a month, real time. But for Hank, it had actually been a long time, a little over a year and a month. Maybe he was married by now, or more likely, no longer interested in her. She let the thought drop. No point in worrying about it. She'd find out soon enough. She let Deegan, now wearing a cloth jacket over his tattered shirt, lead her and Cray out of the ship and down the ramp. They strode across the hangar deck in silence as service technicians swarmed around the transport. The decontamination chamber was nothing more than a narrow spot in the main passage leading from the deck. As the three of them stepped inside, big metal doors ahead and behind them slid shut with a loud bang. She thought it would be much easier on the nerves to not have such loud doors. But at every base, the decontamination doors slammed shut. A very annoying design feature. A fine mist and bluish light filled the area. Joyce always thought the decontamination chamber smelled like apples. But Deegan said it was more like floor polish. They had argued about it a number of times. Again, she smelled apples. She turned slightly as they stood for the required 30 seconds so that she could see Cray better. He seemed to be used to the process. No trace of emotion crossed that cold face, at least none that she could see. She, on the other hand, hated the procedure. She always felt naked in these chambers. Not only were they killing the unwanted microscopic bugs that might be hitching rides, but somewhere behind some monitors, people she didn't know were looking her insides over very carefully for bigger bugs. Alien-type bugs. She was glad they did, but it still made her feel very exposed, knowing someone, maybe even Hank, was looking at her every private part. She again shook off the thought and turned to Cray. "So, what brings you to scenic Charon?" "Apart from us, that is," Deegan said. "Excuse me, Deegan, but I'm trying to have a conversation with a real human." Cray smiled slightly, and Joyce immediately liked him better. "Thanks for the interest, but it's classified." He turned and actually looked at her. "Need to know and all that." "And we don't need to know?" "Got it in one," Cray said, but his eyes told her it was nothing personal. "Figures," Deegan said as the chamber doors banged open and they entered the carpeted area of the base. Kleist has this place sewn up tighter than a frog's butt. Mr. Cray, Professor Kleist said as he rounded the corner 10 meters in front of them, and Joyce instantly tightened. The professor gave her the creeps. His cheeks seemed to always be flushed, and his eyes felt more like animal eyes than human ones. 2 others followed the professor, and Joyce shuddered again as they came into sight. One was the professor's main henchman, Larson, a tall, wiry man who was by far the nastiest human she had ever met. The other was the professor's android secretary, Grace. Grace had short blonde hair, a body only science could manufacture, and a smile that could freeze a waterfall. Joyce regarded all 3 with equal loathing. She'd never had a run-in with any of them, but she had heard enough stories. Speak of the devil, Joyce said softly as they continued towards the professor. And he shall appear, Cray said, just as softly. A moment later, he was smiling and shaking the professor's hand as introductions were made. I trust you had a comfortable flight, Kleist asked Cray. Yes, Cray said, glancing at Joyce. It was most enlightening. Good, good. Glad to hear it. Kleist patted Cray on the back, then steered him away from the pilots and down the hall. We must get to our business. Joyce and Deegan stood and watched the professor's party walk away. When they were far enough away, Joyce said softly, He could be interesting. Who? Deegan asked. Kleist or the corporation's suit? None of your damn business, she said. Ha! You have a heart under all that ice after all. Yeah, Joyce said. I do. It belonged to my last wise-ass co-pilot. Deegan laughed as they followed the professor and his group at a safe and sane distance into the human sections of the station. In the silent quarters of the Marines, Sergeant Green slowly picked through Boone's locker. Choi was nowhere to be found, and the others were at dinner. It was as good a time as any to finish up his most dreaded chore. He glanced down at the rows of single, tightly made beds and green lockers. When they had arrived, this room had been full of life and energy, full of his men. Now only half of them were left. He had cleaned out over half his troops' personal effects and shipped them back to families on Earth. Half dead. How could that be? And now he was doing another. This was wrong. This was different than losing good men and women fighting an enemy. Here, his soldiers had died at the hands of alien prisoners, solely for the benefits of Professor Kleist and ZCT Corporation's research. This wasn't war. This wasn't honorable death. This was just profit. He picked up a photo Boone had of her friends. It was taken on a green lawn on Earth, with the Earth orbit shuttle in the background, right before their departure on this mission. Boone's arm was around Choi, and they were both beaming like the world was the nicest, safest place to be. Green supposed that together it had seemed that way then. But now Boone was dead, rammed through by an alien and covered in acid blood. And Choi was alone. Green shook his head. As they always said, the Corps took everything you've got to give, and then more. Green dropped the photo on top of the few belongings Boone had left and closed the box. He picked it up and tucked it under his arm. Such a small box, so few things for a human to leave behind. He glanced around the room at the freshly made beds, the perfect order of the lockers. Alive or dead, he was proud of his men and of the Marines. It was all he knew. It was his life and his soul. Maybe the Corps did take everything you had to give, but it was never in vain. Never, as long as someone remembered.